What happens when a family gathers to sort through a dead man's estate and uncover secrets no one was ready for? Find out in Appropriate, now playing at the Only Theater Center. From Tony Award-winning playwright Brendan Jacobs Jenkins, critics have called Appropriate part family sitcom, part sibling deathmatch, part socio-political gut punch, and a masterclass in gritty, unrestrained performance. Audiences are loving it too, so much so that it's been extended through April 26th. But seats are going fast, so don't miss it. Visit onlytheater.org to grab yours before they're gone.
The French have a phrase, joie de vivre, the joy of living. Alliance Française brings that joy through French language classes, culture, and community straight to you. Classes start May 2nd, but first, try a free Zoom class the week of April 20th. No commitment, no excuses. Early bird pricing ends April 17th. Visit francedc.org and sign up today. Today on CityCast DC, once upon a time, the food critic of the Washington Post was an all-powerful figure in the restaurant industry, and a totally anonymous one, too. But the paper's new critic, Elazar Sontag, takes over at a very different moment. Sontag and I had a long chat about the Washington dining scene, the role of a critic, and how to communicate about food in 2026. Today is Thursday, April 9th. I'm Michael Schaefer, and here's what DC is talking about. Hey, Elazar, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. Happy to be here.
So it's been, we're coming up on a year now. How are you settling into DC?
Less than a year. I think I've been here maybe 6 months. So it still feels brand new. I think I feel just settled now at about month 6, but it's been a whirlwind, a learning experience, curveballs left and right. Mm-hmm. Very exciting.
Tell us the backstory of how you got to Washington and how you became a food critic.
Sure. I have had a fascination, really a love affair with restaurants and cooking since I was pretty young. I grew up working in restaurants and teaching at a cooking camp. I've just always really loved to be around food. And originally I thought that I would kind of go more in the direction of, cooking for a living, whether it was in restaurants or at a cooking camp, whatever it might be. I ended up just developing this interest in food culture, the best way to approach it being, for me, writing about interesting people who were making food. And so I just fell into this niche where I realized that really the way I most liked to be in restaurants, in people's kitchens, was writing about them. And so I did that for a long time. I landed eventually at Eater, working on national stories during the pandemic, which was, not the job I imagined, but none of us had the jobs we imagined in 2020. And then after that, I was at Bon Appetit magazine covering restaurants there. And that's where I was really covering restaurants on a national level. It wasn't criticism in exactly the same way that I practice criticism now, but my big yearly project was scouting the country. So traveling, New Orleans, Austin, Portland, Maine, and Oregon to compile a list of the best new restaurants each year. And I loved that project because it was essentially the work of creating a snapshot of culture at a moment in time that would then pass. And that next year there would be a new snapshot of culture. And so that's the work I have been doing. And I landed here as a result of that. I've always wanted to do restaurant criticism in the way that I am now. Mm-hmm. And I view it as the work essentially of creating those snapshots of culture just on a weekly basis instead of on a yearly basis, in a city instead of in the country.
Yeah, so now you are like that vanishing breed. You're the hometown newspaper food critic. And historically, at least, that position enabled somebody to put butts in seats or keep butts out of seats or get a place shut down. But it all is also predicated on being super aware of the restaurant scene into which you've been dropped. So getting to know Washington, how many times are you eating out a week? How many of those are places that you're actually writing about versus just places you're going to take the temperature of this culture?
That's a great question because it gets at the question that I am asking myself every day, which is how do I learn DC while teaching people about DC, right? I kind of have my personal job right now, which is figuring out the city. And then I have my professional job, which is helping other people understand it. And so to answer your first question, I eat out most weeks 7 nights. Occasionally, I take a night off if I've just really hit a wall. It does happen. I'm in as many as 7 to 9 restaurants in a week.
Phew. How do you keep your girlish figure?
Well, the jury's definitely out on that one. Let's check again in 6 months. But part of what I've really enjoyed about this job so far is that I reiterate to my readers, to my audience, whenever I have the chance, that I am not trying to pretend that I understand DC as well as even they might if they've lived here for 3 decades, which a lot of my readers have. And what I tell them instead is that, I'm just offering people a way to see the city and the region anew through my eyes, through the eyes of a newcomer. So I'm trying to kind of bring people along on this journey of figuring out a city. And the best feedback I've gotten, or the feedback that's meant the most to me so far, has been, longtime Washingtonians reaching out just to say, I didn't know about this restaurant, or I, haven't been out to Annandale in a long time, or I forgot about this restaurant, when I talk about old restaurants. So I'm learning as I go, and I'm really just trying to bring people along as opposed to faking it, pretending that I know the whole city. I don't.
Well, so as a critic, I've always wanted to know this. Like when you're reviewing a place and you're saying, go here, don't go here, and you attach a rating to it, are you reviewing it sort of against all the other options that your readers in Washington, D.C. might have? Or are you reviewing, this French restaurant against the sort of beau ideal globally of what a French restaurant should be?
A bit of both. So the way in which I would say I am comparing a restaurant to other restaurants in the city, or kind of contextualizing it within the landscape of other restaurants in the city, is, let's say I'm reviewing a steakhouse. That's where having some understanding of the landscape, some sort of institutional knowledge of the city does matter very much. And so I don't want to tell people this is the best steakhouse, the best, omakase in DC if I haven't done the work, gotten educated on the options. And so in that way, I am learning the city as I go. But if I'm reviewing a restaurant and I'm kind of making a proclamation, I'm also doing a lot of work in the background to make sure that I've been to the competition. So in that way, I'm writing about restaurants in relation to one another. But at the same time, I brought back star ratings. That was one of the first things I did when I got to the newspaper. Our star rating scale had been not quite in retirement. It had been taking a nap during the pandemic. So I woke it up. But part of what I explained to readers when I woke it up, when I brought these stars back, is that when I was reviewing restaurants for star consideration, I wouldn't be holding a hot dog stand or a taco truck or a pizza shop up against a steakhouse or, a fine dining 10-course extravaganza, because I don't think that's how people eat, right? When people are looking for a 3-star, or a 4-star restaurant, they know whether they want a steakhouse or a taco shop or a pizza spot. And so I try to put a bit of the, agency in the hands of my readers. And I'm telling you, I think this is a superlative version of this business, right?
Gotcha.
I think this is as good as a taco shop gets, and as good as it gets in DC, but also on par with, anything you might experience in LA if you're a reader who travels and is coming here. So I try to sort of do a bit of both. I want to give people the context. I want people to know that I'm doing the background work, but I do also want them to take some of these scales, these measurements like the star ratings as, just part of the occasion, I want them to take it as just part of the equation of how do you choose where you're going to have your next meal.
So when you go out to a place, knowing the power you have over it, maybe, how many times do you go there before you feel like you can be like doing a fair job by them?
3 visits is sort of the long-held standard for restaurant criticism. Of course, there are fewer and fewer restaurant critics in this country, and budgets generally have shrunk. And so there is definitely, a shift that's happened where plenty of restaurant critics can't go as many times. Of course, they're now competing with influencers and social media users who are going to make a judgment much faster than you can when you're going 3 times. I still, with rare exception, go 3 times because I find that is how I have the broadest, most evened out view of a restaurant. It really is like taking an average. Restaurants are very human. So one night, a fabulous restaurant might be kind of in the weeds and the service is off and the cooking is uneven. And you go back a month later and, they've had a bit of calm, they've recharged, the dining room's not as busy, and it's firing on all cylinders. And so part of how I distinguish myself as a restaurant critic as opposed to, some of the other perfectly legitimate places people now go to get their restaurant recommendations is I do try to offer people a level of consistency. I'm not telling you about this restaurant until I've really made a verdict.
Right.
And that feels very important to me in an era where there are less restaurant critics.
So you mentioned you brought back the star ratings. And another thing you've done away with, the change since you've become the food critic at the Washington Post, is this idea of the anonymous food critic who, dons a disguise so they don't give him extra special treatment and he can represent the regular diner. Why'd you do that?
I did it for a lot of reasons, to be just honest and upfront and kind of set the stage. The most immediate pressing reason I did it is because, I grew up on the internet. And so the real work of kind of wiping my face, not having a digital footprint would have been very complicated. And frankly, if that is who the Washington Post really wanted, they probably wouldn't have hired me in the first place. I just didn't have that sort of shroud of secrecy. But I also believe, and a lot of my predecessors across the board, not just in DC, believe too, that the work of being anonymous has largely become kind of a theater act.
Yeah.
Tom Seitz, my predecessor here, wrote about this as he was kind of bidding farewell. Jonathan Gold, the iconic Los Angeles restaurant critic, wrote about this, I believe, more than a decade ago, that a lot of what it meant to be anonymous, even before social media was so ubiquitous, was pretending that you didn't notice that the chef had noticed you. And the chef had the extra job of pretending that you hadn't made eye contact and everyone knew everyone was there.
Right.
And
you're kind of pulling one over on the readers in that case.
And I did feel that I noticed that readers, some took issue with the idea that I wouldn't be anonymous when I got here. Well, how are you going to give an unbiased take? You're going to be getting this over the top, ridiculous treatment. And sometimes I do get that treatment, but I want to be able to talk about it openly and transparently because critics have gotten that treatment for a very long time. There's one other element of it, which is definitely a factor, and other critics, including Mackenzie Fagan at the San Francisco Chronicle, but lots of people across the country have written about this, that part of what happens too is, if you can pay a high-powered PR firm, then you might know what the anonymous restaurant critic looks like. And if you don't have that resourcing, the restaurant critic, might be someone who really kind of flies under your radar. And so part of it is also just saying, this is what I look like. If you care, now you know. If you don't, that's fine too. But here is my face when I come into a restaurant.
Well, and then I guess this is related, but why did you bring back the star ratings? I mean, I think some critics thought that doesn't have nearly enough nuance. But tell me about your thinking there.
They don't have enough nuance on their own, but I think that they do play a fundamentally important role, in the ecosystem of a restaurant review, right? A restaurant review's ultimate purpose is to tell you, where should I eat lunch? Where should I eat dinner? Where should I go for breakfast? And I want to be able to do the work of cultural criticism and analysis and, helping people understand why their food matters beyond their one meal. But I also want people to read me. And I think for people to have the most sense of investment, they want a clear sense of where I land on a matter. And so I view it as a way to kind of do a bit of yes and. Yes, it's not a perfectly nuanced system. And if you want to understand all my nuance, read my 1,200 word
Right.
review. It doesn't stop with the stars. That's the first line. It's had sort of a mixed welcome. I think some readers do find them reductive, and I understand that. Then you can ignore them. If the stars don't help you, that's fine. But at a moment when the star is such a ubiquitous cultural symbol, right, that we make so many decisions based on the star rating of a movie, an Amazon item, a restaurant on Yelp, the idea that a restaurant critic wouldn't be able to use that legible language with their readership felt like a missed opportunity to me.
And in your case, to be clear, you have defined the stars in a certain way so that even 0 stars, it's not like awful. I mean, you write, I think, adequate. So I was going to ask you, what's the worst meal you've had since you've been in DC? And I know you gave 0 stars to Aqua Bisteca, but I expect that probably wasn't actually the worst meal you had.
No, and I actually made a distinction in my initial explanation of my star system, which, for the record, I do just want to say, because I have noticed some people take issue with the idea of a 4-star scale, right? That one is, the way that I have it set up is 0 stars can either mean poor or satisfactory, in which case I'll tell you it's either poor or satisfactory. Aqua Bisteca I thought was satisfactory. Then there's a 4-star scale starting with good, up through superlative. And I've noticed some people saying, well, why would you introduce a system that's different than everyone else's system? Everyone uses a 5-star scale. That's actually not true. So restaurant reviews, whether it's a great system, time will tell. And it's been interesting to see reactions, but the New York Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Minnesota Star Tribune, restaurant reviews have long existed on a 4-star scale. So I did rework it a little bit. As far as Aqua Bisteca, no, it was not the worst meal I've had in the city. And, as I wrote, I thought that the restaurant had redeeming qualities. The reason that I didn't, mark it as poor is because I think the chef in charge actually has a lot of good ideas. And his pastas are often excellent, and, the dishes that he rotates through the specials section can be quite interesting, but it's a very corporate restaurant. It's part of this Michael Mina sort of celebrity chef restaurant group with over 30 locations, which is fine. I'm not dinging them for having a lot of restaurants, but it felt very corporate in a way that I think was hampering a talented chef.
So dare I ask what the worst meal you've had is?
Well, no, because that will ruin my upcoming pan.
Okay. Oh no!
You're gonna have to wait for that. I'm half joking because, I will certainly write about really bad restaurants when I think that it's useful for readers to avoid them. Very buzzy, popular spots that cost a lot of money or just that otherwise are of significance. I'm not trying to sort of work my way around your question, but I am genuinely more focused at the moment on telling people where I think they should eat. I've only got about a dozen reviews under my belt so far, and I can understand the appeal of really grabbing people's attention with, just an awful review. But that's not what's most useful for me right now as I try to figure out the city. And I don't think it's what's most useful to readers. I know that those reviews are fun to read, but I want to dole them out thoughtfully and responsibly. So I promise that they will come, but they'll come when the moment to me feels right, fitting.
So I appreciate your having explained your version of the star system to me, but explain a little bit about the person doling out the stars, because obviously it is a subjective thing. So for you, just so people can understand how to interpret your reviews, what do you just not care about that's really not going to affect your reviewing that somebody else might put more weight on?
Okay, I'll give you a slightly longer version of my answer, and then if you need me to cut to the chase, you just tell me. The way that I reintroduced these stars, my main sort of thesis was I will review a restaurant and I will measure its success in relation to its own sort of stated goal and purpose. And what I mean by that is I want to understand whether this is a superlative, pizza joint. I want to understand if this is a superlative $600 tasting menu. And so when I'm thinking about a restaurant, when I'm writing reviews, that really is what I'm thinking about. And so, at that $600 tasting menu, what are the things that are important to me? Well, the food, of course, is important to me. And the presentation is important to me. The service is also important to me in a very specific way at a restaurant that costs that much money. The design of the space, the volume of the music. But that's not what all restaurants want to be. And that's not what all restaurants claim to be. And so, to be very honest, if I'm at just sort of a low-key neighborhood restaurant, Italian restaurant on my corner that is serving pastas for less than $25, no, maybe I don't care that much that there's not a painting hung in the bathroom or that, the playlist isn't to my liking. I'll still tell people some of these things maybe, but that's not going to factor heavily necessarily into, a star rating, because I really am trying to tell you, is this a great neighborhood restaurant? So I'm not holding it up against a restaurant that has, 4 servers circling around each table. What I care about really changes depending on the kind of restaurant.
The late congressman and civil rights icon John Lewis has always been one of my personal heroes. Maybe you've even seen that beautiful mural celebrating him in Southeast. So I will definitely be honoring his spirit and legacy at one of the hottest shows of the spring that is already selling out fast. Young John Lewis, Prodigy of Protest, is the electrifying new hip-hop musical taking over the Atlas Performing Arts Center, with over 15 performances already sold out. From award-winning DC playwright Soul Miami 24 and Grammy-nominated Kokai, this is the untold origin story of a true legend. They are taking it back before he was a congressman, back before he made history. Young John Lewis, Prodigy of Protest, plays March 26th through May 3rd at the Atlas Performing Arts Center. Get your tickets at mosaictheater.org and I will see you there. Life can change faster than DC's seasons. One moment, everything feels normal, and next, your world is turned upside down. So don't let someone else's mistake ruin your spring. Call the team you can count on. NACE Law Group has been standing up for DC families for decades, fighting for neighbors hurt by medical malpractice, wrongful death, and serious injuries. They don't just settle quickly or push papers. They dig in, fight hard, and make sure every client gets the justice they deserve. And here is something that I love. They are a longtime supporter of CityCast, because just like us, they really care about this community and the folks who call it home. So if you or someone that you care about has been hurt, don't wait. Call NACE Law Group. They'll stand with you, fight for your family, and make sure your rights are protected so that you can focus on what matters most.
Spring is here, and it is finally that rare time of year in DC when it's neither too cold nor too hellishly hot to open your windows. So don't miss out. Window Nation's The More You Buy, The More You Save sale is going on now. You could save up to 50% off all windows for your home. Window Nation's installation crews finish the job in 1 day or less, so you can enjoy the breeze with minimal disruption. Best of all, they offer a lifetime warranty on all their windows, so you can relax knowing your home is protected far into the future. Hurry! This sale ends soon. Schedule a fast free consultation now at windownation.com. So you used to be in New York, and there's a lot of people in New York or Paris or London or places with legendary dining scenes who maybe they think of Washington as a bit of a cow town. Well, what has surprised you in coming here?
Yeah, I think that is a pretty fundamental misunderstanding of what DC is. I understand that, DC has this sort of steakhouse history and it can be hard to shake these sorts of, stereotypes. But I would say that DC makes most sense to me as I've come to learn the city, less in comparison to a city like New York and more like Los Angeles. The idea that DC is at the center of this complex, layered, vibrant web of communities and of restaurants and of chefs from all around the world. And so I think that the largest, misunderstanding of DC from people who don't live here is that it is just really one note. That has shifted already. There are some really big name restaurants in the city that have shifted that perception in the last decades. But there are still people who don't understand just the sheer diversity and also breadth of options. You don't have to drive very far out of DC, to get incredible Vietnamese food. You don't have to leave the city at all to get some of the best Ethiopian food in the world. So DC is extremely layered. It's not New York. It's not Los Angeles. It's not Chicago. It's not San Francisco. But, why should it try to be those things?
Right.
It's its own city. And I think that DC is at its best when it operates as its own city, when it doesn't feel like it's in comparison or competition with any of these other places.
So the flip side of you being an outsider to Washington, and maybe some people are suspicious of that, is that, at least to me, I think a lot of people who live here, including people who live here and write about food, there's a temptation to become kind of a homer, right? We're really pulling for the local restaurant scene. We want it to be awesome and we want to help the people in it. I mean, are you worried about that temptation overcoming you as you settle in, as you become part of this community, as you get to know people?
No, I'm really not. I think
you're just
that
pure sadist.
Not at all. On the contrary, I think that my job is to help those people who are so proud of their restaurants, so proud of the culture of DC, to have the best possible experience every day when they go out to eat. And so, I'm not going to hype up, restaurants that I don't believe in just because, they have received a lot of hometown love. And, I'm also going to do the opposite, hype up restaurants a lot, whether they're new or longstanding, when I think that it's time for our readership, our diner base, to really go show a place some love. But no, I don't worry too much about sort of, maybe getting too comfortable almost is what you're describing, because it's my job to always be moving on to what's next.
Right.
I write a review, even of a restaurant that I think is the best in the city. I might not go back there for 5 years, because when am I going to do that? I have to go to the next restaurant. So, I'm comfortable in DC, but I never get too comfortable at any one restaurant.
I don't think it's comfort so much as, you live here, you love it, and you want everyone in the rest of the world to think you're cool because you live here. And that, I think, tends to sort of create a desire to have the dining scene around you be seen as like amazing. And maybe eventually that leads to pulled punches, or obviously if you're doing your job, it doesn't, but I feel like that's constantly a temptation.
Yeah, I'm not interested in inflation and sort of grading on a curve. And if you notice that starting to happen, text me,
Okay,
let me know. I just don't think that that's what's most helpful for diners. I don't think that that's most helpful for chefs either. I think that a critic can serve the role of telling a restaurant or telling a chef whether they're on the right track, in my single opinion. And that loses a lot of weight when you become just sort of a cheerleader.
The homerism temptation can also manifest in maybe an undue amount of hostility to like the famous New York or Miami restaurant that brand extensions its way into DC. Mm-hmm. What do you make of that? Which to me feels like a sort of a phenomenon very much of our moment in Washington. What do you make of that?
Without casting judgment on any one restaurant, I really don't have a problem with restaurant groups, but I do think that there is an element of what's happening here right now with major restaurant groups, but also, to be clear, what's happening in a lot of major cities. It's not just DC, where, it's been a very challenging couple of years for a variety of reasons, especially here in DC. And, landlords and investors and even chefs, of course, too, want to play it safe.
Right.
They want to have the feeling that what they're going to open will hit, that it just doesn't necessarily, to all people, feel like a time for risk taking. So I don't care that much about restaurant groups. If a great restaurant group drops into town, wonderful, great. I'm glad to have, insert the blank restaurant. But my concern is more when it starts to feel like a restaurant scene has no choice but to play it very, very safe. I don't think we're there, but I think there's a glimmer of that. I think there's a glimmer of that playing out across a lot of the country right now, and I look forward to when that passes.
And that was at the core of your no-star review of Aqua Bisteca.
It was.
That you dinged them for being too cautious.
I wasn't trying to make a statement about a certain kind of restaurant. Really, my experience of Aqua Bisteca was that when I was eating dinner there, it just was not a super exciting experience. All of the steaks are prepared the exact same way. All of the grilled fish comes with the exact same sauce and side dish. And really, it was me asking myself, well, why is it like this that led me to sort of the corporate structure of the restaurant group? There can be a great restaurant run by a corporate. To give something heart that is part of a much bigger operation takes a little bit more work.
You mentioned you're not going through the charade of anonymity. But so what is it like to be recognized when you go into a place or whenever you're around sort of food people?
Peculiar, I would say.
How so?
And just to give a brief disclaimer, not that this always even works particularly well, but I do still book all of my meals under aliases. My goal is for restaurants to not know that I'm coming. Once I get there, I don't pretend to be someone else. If someone comes over and shakes my hand and introduces themselves, I tend to say, "Hi, I'm Elazar. It's great to meet you." I'm not pretending to be someone else, but I am trying to avoid a certain amount of kind of preparation happening. It can feel really uncomfortable, and it can absolutely make the job more difficult because, there is a level of service and attention that if I'm getting it, it can obscure my understanding of what the service at the restaurant is actually like. And I know that a restaurant, of course they're going to do that. What else would they do? I don't go home and think to myself, oh, the service at this restaurant is spectacular. I go home and think to myself, I have no idea how the service at this restaurant is.
Right.
So there are elements of it that are challenging. There are also elements of it that have been really rewarding because I run into diners and readers and just local food lovers on the street in my neighborhood, at my gym, at the wine shop. And I get to talk to them about their favorite restaurants. And I go to those restaurants. I mean, I take those seriously and I add them to my list. I put them on my calendar. It's also interesting to meet chefs. I keep those relationships as much as I can, sort of at arm's length, for obvious reasons. But if a chef comes over to my table and introduces themselves, I don't, of course, like I said, pretend to be someone else. So I've met a lot of the restaurant community too. And, I just have to keep myself honest that even if I meet a chef in person because they know who I am and I think they're wonderful, I still want to be able to speak honestly and openly about my experience at the restaurant, whether it's wonderful or less than.
The other thing is, I guess, we're in an age of like extreme and sometimes like really hateful pushback against people who do things in the public eye. And you've put your individuality into the public eye. After the Aqua Bisteca review, I noticed like there was on social media, someone had like conflated your name with that of an extreme right-wing Israeli minister. That seemed like a weird and ugly thing to do. What is that like? I mean, that is another thing that the anonymous food critic of yore didn't have to deal with. It's
challenging, I think, in the way that it is for really anyone who now exists on the internet, which to varying degrees is all of us, whether you're sort of in the public eye, like you said, or you just get into, a fight in the comment section about your favorite celebrity and someone says something really nasty to you who you've never met. I think the difference for me is that it can hurt my feelings. It can make me feel bad. I can, for a moment, feel sorry for myself. But it also reminds me of the genuine impact of reviews, whether they're positive or negative. Even if someone says something really horrible to me, perhaps especially then, I am reminded that my reviews can be impactful in a way that, of course, does not positively impact everyone, does not leave everyone with, a good taste in their mouth. And that's part of the work. There's no way to avoid that. But I also take it seriously. And so, do I wish that everyone on the internet loved me and was always telling me how talented and wonderful and handsome I am? Of course. But that's not the job that I took. I'm telling this to someone else who does a job in the public eye. I think this is part of
public ear.
A public ear. Yes, exactly. I guess the public pen. You just find a way to integrate that into your life, that there are more people than just your closest friends and family who have opinions of you. And that's okay. It's great for people to know you and love you and appreciate you, but that's not going to be everyone, period. That's just the way it is.
I want to ask you for some practical dining advice, but before I do, one other question. You just mentioned this power that obviously comes with the job. And, there was a time when the Washington Post's food critic was a colossus bestriding the city. You could get a place closed to get make diners flee. In your brief time at the Post, the publication is obviously, and this is not shade, but they've decided to be a different kind of publication when it comes to their relationship with the hometown and as a paper of record for the hometown. Is that changing your marching orders? And do you have a sense of what it's doing to your practical power?
The answer is no. It has not changed my marching orders. And just to be very transparent, it has not affected my capacity, my resourcing to do this work. I still go to a place 3 times. I'm not being hounded to produce, more coverage. Like, I am doing the job that I was brought here to do. It's the job that Tom Sietsema did before me and the job that Phyllis Richmond did before him. And so in the most immediate practical sense, no, my work hasn't changed. I'm going to keep reviewing restaurants the way I have and telling people where to eat. I think that the role of the critic at the Post has changed tremendously for reasons that go far beyond the Post. Yes, it's been a very hard and in some ways heartbreaking time at the Post since I got here. But a lot of the changes to the impact of a restaurant critic have more to do with the ecosystem of social media and how people get their information. People locally, I don't have to tell your listeners this, still care about the Washington Post so much. It is still a hometown paper. It's also a national paper. It's a serious national paper, of course, but people are still really, really reading locally. That's why they have a local restaurant critic. That's why I'm not being told to go review restaurants in New York or San Francisco. And so I think that my relationship with my readers remains kind of unchanged from generations past, but do my reviews have the same impact on restaurants that they would have 20 years ago? No, definitely not. But our monoculture has just evaporated. No one has the impact they had 20, 30, 40 years ago. I now have a really dedicated readership, people who love to go out to eat. They see a review go up on a Thursday or they read it in the Sunday paper and they go to that restaurant. So I still think about the impact. I try not to think too much about, what my life would have been like if I had this job 40 years ago. I mean, before this, I worked at Condé Nast, where if I had this job 40 years ago, I probably would have a private jet. So, I try not to dwell. I still feel incredibly lucky and grateful. And the readers who are with me are so with me and they're so dedicated. And I mean, what more could you wish for in 2026 in journalism?
Let me give you like a lightning round to finish. I just want some advice here.
Yes.
And I've sort of farmed this out to some colleagues too. Best place to take your mother-in-law?
Lutece.
Where's that?
It's in Georgetown. It's a great little kind of modern bistro by the Popal group. So they also have Maison Bar à Vin, and just the chef, Matt Conroy, is very talented. And it's a very romantic little place for just you and your mother-in-law if you can get in. It's small, but it really does the trick. Okay,
best place to go on a third date with someone you want to impress?
When I really want to impress my partner, who I've been with for closer to 5 years, I take him to Izakaya Seki, which is just a Japanese restaurant that's been around for quite a long time, much, much, much longer than I've been here, but it remains very special and very romantic without feeling too kind of stuffy. And that's the great style for a third date.
Best place to go for a work drink where you've got to be really neutral?
Oh, God, am I ever neutral at a work drink? I don't think so. My very kind of localized answer to my office, being on K Street, is Isla, this kind of Caribbean steakhouse-ish restaurant that was one of my early reviews when I got here. It's pretty new to the city. I like it because it has some of that kind of old DC feel. It's very luxurious. It's got a massive chandelier in the middle of the room. You know, you really can go there with your boss or on a first date or whatever it might be, but there's sort of a lounge section of the restaurant, so you can have a very informal experience of the restaurant, and the drinks are quite good.
All right. Best place to take your enemy, like someone you can't trust.
I would take them to Gemini. It's a little pasta bar that's standing room only, and I would position myself close to the door. So if they, pulled up the butter knife, I could just run.
What's the most memorable dish you've had?
It's funny, like the most memorable dish I've eaten really keeps changing with the week just because I'm spending so much time in restaurants. At this restaurant that I don't know when this episode comes out, depending, the date will change, but the most recent review of this Hunan restaurant in Vienna serves a dish of century eggs, which are these kind of long cured eggs in Chinese cuisine that turn black. The white and the yolk turns black. So they've got this very sort of stark appearance, but they're very, very mild. And they're served with crushed chilies, fermented bean curd, and eggplant. And it was an amazing dish. And the texture of it was like bone marrow mixed with foie gras. It was such a delicacy. And it stuck with me just because it's rare in this line of work that I eat something that feels still totally novel and exciting to me. And when that happens, it's like that moment of Ratatouille when the critic has the bite and, his pen or his fork or whatever he's holding drops out of his hand. I mean, you don't experience that often, but when you do, it really does stick with you.
What's the name of that Hunanese restaurant?
It's called Chef Tan.
What's your favorite martini you've had so far?
The awful thing about a martini is you so rarely remember that you drank it.
Right.
I would say I had a nice one at Jane, which is a relatively recently opened bar. I've heard that there is an extremely good one at Your Only Friend, this new sort of bar and sandwich shop that opened sometime in the last, I want to say year or so, but I haven't been yet. So that I would say is at the top of my martini list. But I it's a bucket list I try to work through relatively slowly.
And last question, favorite dessert so far?
I'll give you two. One is at Mandalay, this Burmese restaurant in Silver Spring. They serve this dish that is sort of like a griddled little caramelized baked cake that I believe is essentially sort of like almost like cream of wheat mixed with raisins and then cooked until it's like the darkness of a cannelé. And it's chewy and crispy and extremely sweet and salty. And it's just insanely good. And it comes so, so hot. And I always leave with like the worst burn possible on my tongue. But it's wonderful. And that restaurant is really just a charming, like long-standing neighborhood place that people should check out if they haven't been. And then at Maison Bar à Vin, which is another one, this is the counterpart to Lutèce that I mentioned earlier, there is a Basque cheesecake, which is a pretty wild dish. The center is like barely baked. So it's just this kind of lovely layer of cheesecake on the outside. And then at the center, it's just this sort of like runny, sweet, funky, intense cheese. And I believe if you pay a little extra, they will shave black truffles over it. But that felt like gilding the lily. So I haven't done that yet.
Elazar Sontag, thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a real pleasure.
That's all for today here on CityCast DC. If you enjoyed the show, why not tell a friend, rate the show, leave us a review, and subscribe to our morning newsletter. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more news from around the city. Bye.